Welcome to Slow and Steady, the podcast where you get to follow along as we figure out how to build products and recover from burnout. I'm Brian.
And I'm Benedikt. Each week, we'll give you an honest peek into our lives as we figure things out. Today is January 26th, and I'm feeling thoughtful.
This is episode number 75, and I am feeling inspired. So today is a little bit different. Adii Pienaar joined us to talk about his new book, Life Profitability, the New Measure of Entrepreneurial Success. We had such a delightful conversation, and I'm certain that you're going to enjoy it. So let's get on with the show. Well, great. We are joined today by Adii Pienaar. Adii, you've written a book called Life Profitability, the New Measure of Entrepreneurial Success. So, for listeners who may not be aware that you are a 3x founder of successful companies like WooThemes and Convergio, can you give us just a little bit of your background and your bio, a few things that led you to the point where you wanted to write a book about life profitability?
Yeah, totally. And gents, firstly, thanks for having me. That's the first thing, right? Second thing, Brian, I'm totally getting you to just do that kind of hype and intro, whenever I appear anywhere. You pronounce the book title so perfectly. I still my tongue gets tied. So you definitely have a radio voice there. So thanks for you're starting on a highlight there.
Cool. Anytime you need a hype man to follow you around Europe, I'm your guy. Yeah.
Awesome. Totally gonna keep that in mind. So I mean, kind of by way of introduction, and I would assume, guys, by the way, that not because I have this massive reputation, but I think many of the kind of slow and steady kind of listeners, the audience, would probably kind of overlap with the audiences and kind of communities that I've been active in the last couple of years. So I'll keep the bio a bit short, but essentially, and kind of where the book comes from is building, selling, to software businesses, which is the thing the things that people most point to, right? Those are the things that gets used in kind of one-liners in a biography. But I think along the way that there are so many things that people don't see about my journey, at least, and many other entrepreneurs. But for my journey, I think there are the failures kind of in between, right? Nobody speaks or asked me about kind of the startup that failed between, exiting kind of WooThemes to commerce and starting Convergio, right? That gets kind of lost. Nobody speaks about the mistakes that I made that weren't going to end up not being fatal, right? And crucially, kind of, nobody asked me about kind of the life costs that went into kind of building these businesses, right? And, in all honesty, for the biggest part of that journey, I was not aware of the life costs that I was accruing along that kind of journey. So that's kind of why I'm here today. As I said, I am a successful entrepreneur and founder, and yet I believe that there's a better way forward for myself and all entrepreneurs. And the book really is about putting some of those ideas out into the world.
Mm-hmm. I love. Well, yeah. So I want to ask you about the opening quote in the book, in the opening chapter. I think that the thing that I'm loving about it is just completely sprinkled all the way through with these incredibly inspirational quotes and just your own philosophy. There's as much poetry and philosophy from you in this as, hey, yeah, I'm a quote unquote successful entrepreneur with a number of very nice exits in your background, but you don't lead with that at all, or at least that's my take. And so I'm finding that to be completely refreshing and different. And so just want to mention that. But I want to ask you, I love that you open the book with a quote from Thoreau. This amazing quote: "The cost of a thing is the amount of what I will call life, which is required to be exchanged for it, immediately or in the long run." Why did you decide to open the book with that quote?
Yeah, I think, when I read that, again, just taking a step back, right, Brian, I think firstly, the reason why I don't lead with this kind of notion of, but here's Adii's success, here's the whole resume, here's why you should kind of read the book, is I actually don't think that that's the thing that qualifies me to write this book. I think the thing that I'm kind of more proud about myself is my ability to learn new things and my ability to kind of, in my words, connect non-obvious dots, right? And I think in my own journey in the last couple of years, and the journey that kind of part of the journey that inspired writing, my book, Life Profitability, I drew on so many different kind of sources, whether it was kind of philosophy, whether it was poetry, whether it was science fiction books, like anything that was pretty much not kind of a how to, business self-help book. Because I also don't believe in that, but that's a kind of another kind of segue. So when I kind of, as I was building out these and fleshing out this initial idea of, and initially I didn't call it life profitability, by the way. The ideas stem from, within my team at Convergio, where we would speak about building kinder, better businesses, both for ourselves and our customers. Like that was the initial kind of spark. And then I came across this quote from Thoreau, and just that notion of like, whatever we do in life, the cost we pay for that is life itself, right? And that sounds morbid, but I think there's a positive spin to it, which is just that we should just recognize that any pursuit, anything that we pursue, any decision we make, like we're trading, there's an opportunity cost. There is something else there, firstly, and sometimes there are actual costs, right? I mean, the costs that like I often, for example, neglected is I neglected friendships, right? I neglected my marriage at times. I often kind of float in and out of exercising as a kind of as an example. Like those were the kind of the costs that I accrued along the way that I wasn't necessarily kind of aware of. So that's why that kind of Thoreau quote kind of really, really resonated with me.
Yeah, and that's interesting too, because the concepts that you're talking about there, what are you willing to trade in your life over here for what you're doing in your work? And ideally, you're doing these things in your work because it, allows you to leverage things in your life and have experiences that you wouldn't otherwise. And so a lot of people will introduce this concept of work-life balance, which you feel is an incomplete concept. Can you talk a little bit about that and why you think that is the case?
Yeah, and like before I share my hot take on work-life balance, I think the key thing for me there, Brian, is that so often my kind of just me building businesses, I would tell people, listen, I do this for my family. And if you ask my family, like, is this what they want from me? Like, they would not have kind of said that, right? And it's not as binary as kind of either or, right? I think there's a kind of a truth and a path forward in between those two things. But I think many entrepreneurs, myself particularly, I was not being honest with myself at times there. So, like, I think that's key. Like that idea of, when you say you're doing this for other people, is actually checking in and making sure that that is actually the truth, right? And not just building these kind of narratives ourselves. Because as entrepreneurs, we're really good at building narratives, right? We're really good at telling stories generally and selling ourselves. But that doesn't kind of necessarily create value for those around us, right? So the reason I think kind of work-life balance doesn't kind of work, right, is purely because it proposes this idea that kind of work and life are these two completely independent things, and that they can keep each other in balance, right? And I think there's just so much kind of bleeding there, right? So between those two things, because we all know what happens, like when we have a crap day at work, like we take that back home, right? Like we take that into kind of arguments with our spouses, not being present with our kids, not wanting to do fun stuff, right? So there's always going to be a bleeding time, and vice versa. So I think that firstly doesn't work, right? Because there's just kind of interdependence and an interplay between those two things. But broader than that, I think work is just part of life, right? Like I don't think we live to work. So work is just part of life. And when I think about finding balance and finding kind of space in one's life, I think about, how do I balance work with all those other things that are important, within my life, which whether it's family, friends, health, sleep, side projects, passion projects, hobbies, like whatever those other things are, like that doesn't really matter. I think every individual has their own life portfolio there. But just like an investment portfolio, that's how I would think about balancing those things. And it's not just two components. It can't just be work and life. Because I think like, you're always tipping the scale in a very binary manner there. And I don't think that gets people to the ultimate outcome that they were hoping for.
I completely agree with you about all of that. I mean, the notion of, I'm doing this for my family. Well, there are many, many times that my wife and kiddos upstairs would say, well, hey, Dad, in that case, stop because this isn't working. So I completely agree about all that. The tension that I experience and that I see and find is, all of those things that we're talking about here that we do want to balance against this entrepreneurial archetype of suffering and overwork, etc. Hobbies, time with family, experiences in life, etc., etc. Those things require resources to be able to do and enjoy, and to have the freedom of time to be able to do those things guilt-free, to have the money to do those things without putting yourself in an untenable situation. And so there's that tension there that, well, yeah, to do those things and to get there, I gotta put some money in the bank. And so I gotta make this business work. That tension feels extremely real. And what do you say to people who agree with everything that you just said philosophically, but when the rubber meets the road, look, man, I still got this credit card debt I got to get paid off, and I want to, how do you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing, I think many people underestimate the just the power and the benefit of tension, right? So if you think about kind of muscles in the human body, like all of our muscles are in tension, and hence they're able to move, right? So obviously, if they're kind of stretched to the point or kind of rigid to the point where it's not flexible anymore, then yes, then like my hammy is tight, I can't go for a run, kind of thing. So by all means, like it can be a bad thing as well, but when it works, when tension generally works kind of as nature intends it, like it causes kind of, forward motion, or motion at least. So I think that's the first kind of my starting point with tension. What I kind of, the interesting story here is when my publishing team and I set out to, to write the book, like one of the first things they do, like you do in many businesses, is you create this kind of, ideal kind of reader avatar.
Yes.
And like one of the things we define Gina, right, as a kind of, entrepreneur and a single mom, like with a kiddo back home that has a never ending to-do list. And she can't get ahead, right? Because of that tension that you speak about. Like it's like she wants to be present at home, but the business just doesn't grow enough, right, for her to get to that point where she can actually be present at home. So she's constantly juggling these things. And the way I try to kind of create life profitability, not just the concept, in the latter stage of the book, there is actually kind of a process with some worksheets to help individuals like follow or discover their own life profitability. And for me, the key there, Brian, is I didn't want to add to Gina's to-do list, right? Because I knew that was probably not going to get her kind of to make progress towards whatever she defines as her kind of, life profitability. Right. So what I propose in the book is firstly kind of small steps, right? And that those initial kind of small steps are probably very kind of, very close to Gina, right? So things that are very aligned to her, whether that's kind of her values or just something that comes more naturally, right? So going back to that kind of core of who she already is. So not trying to change that, just trying to embrace that. And then the idea and the kind of process is you use that space that you can find, that initial bit of wiggle room. You reinvest that in things that are life profitable. Mm-hmm. And theoretically, if you do that, and i.e., it's not necessarily just reinvesting in the business. It might be that for Gina to create space in that situation, she needs to kind of pick up exercise again, because that creates more physical energy for her to do other things, right? But the idea is then is once you have space, use that space, reinvest it elsewhere until you get to a point, just like you do in business with with profits, where you can reinvest part of the profits back into the business for growth, right? And you can distribute part of those profits into your life. So that's the idea, is like find the space, invest it in things that creates more space until you have kind of, I wouldn't say abundance, but until you have sufficient space that you can really go diverse in terms of like to where you now redistribute those extras, where there's space, resources, or kind of just literally kind of financial profits in the narrow sense of the word.
That's really, really helpful. It feels very practical. I really liked the analogy of the human body too. And the difference between tension and full-on rigidity, stiffness, that image completely connects for me. I mean, I'm in the throes of this situation right now of feeling like, I had a really nice, startup success and some numbers of years ago, and have been trying Yeah, I have. I've been trying so hard to recreate that, and not only recreate it, but double it. Because before that we had less money than we have right now, and in some ways less stress. But on balance, I would not go back. Like to not have resources or to have them. Yes, I will raise my hand and I will have those resources. I think the great thing about your book is the phrase of life profitability, and thinking very, very hard about, okay, how much is enough? How much more do I need, and what am I willing to trade for it? Um, and you talk about the concept in the book about enough and growth for growth's sake, and at some point you got to stop. At some point you have to say, okay, this is good. Can you talk a bit about how you think about growth, and how much growth do you need for it to be sustainable, and anything above that contributes to your life profitability? How do you think through how you do that for yourself, and how would you advise other entrepreneurs to think about growth?
Yeah. So, I mean, and admittedly, sometimes I do it very poorly, right? And I get sucked into the vortex again. I'm like, why is this thing not growing 50% month over month? Like, where is that hockey stick? Like, I'm not seeing it. So I don't always do this really well. I think the things that so growth itself, by the way, I'm not trying to badmouth growth. I think growth is important, right?
Right.
Like you're part of kind of being a learner is to grow. Like I want to grow as like the AD I am today. Like tomorrow's AD should be better, right? Like that is always something that I aspire to. I think the key thing with growth, though, is that it should not be growth at all costs, because that's literally like growth at all costs is the definition of cancer, right? Cells just growing, becoming cancerous, and that's not good for us either. So and again, like I think, back to kind of the muscle analogy, right? Like we see so many of these phenomena, we see them in nature, right? And they're universal laws, and yet we tend to ignore them, right? So I don't think growth at all costs is good. What I do think is good is if you can grow and you are very clear about what that growth means, right? And for me, that growth, coming back to kind of, if you grow to serve or to kind of improve your own life profitability, that makes sense, because the big part of life profitability is like figuring out and being aware of what your highest values are, and also what kind of the costs are to accomplish those things. Because I think if those things kind of not necessarily balance each other out, but if you're realistic in your assessment about what this means, I think what you're ultimately getting is you're kind of, going back to kind of Maslow's hierarchy, right? You're getting more of those kind of things, kind of ticked, right? Which ultimately means like you're a happier you, which means you're a better entrepreneur, which means you're better for your business, right? But I think like having that clarity about what is truly important and then growing towards those things, like that comes first. The business success is almost not it's obviously not a complete byproduct. I'm not suggesting don't do email marketing, for example, just focus on life profitability, right? But like that's the way I at least philosophically think about it. Like you do your work, you focus on your life profitability, you make sure that ripples out from yourself to your team, to your family, to your communities, and then eventually it has this kind of roundabout way to kind of, where you bring it back into your business as well by being a better you, a better Brian, a better Adii, a better Benedikt, right? That's how I think about kind of growth.
That's good. Benedikt, don't let me. I will hog 100% of this conversation and keep Adii for an hour past our time, because I'm loving this conversation. But I mean, you're struggling with this too, man. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mentioned it to you, this to you, Adii. I guess in an email yesterday. I read this book and it sparked a lot of thoughts, because like over the last year or so, and that's is probably also because of COVID and all the other shitty things that happen in the world. Like work has been my escape from everything in a way. And now reading your book, I was like, right now there's not much left other than work. Like, I mean, I enjoy time with my fiance, and that's nice and stuff. But other than that, like, there's not much going on anymore. And it was a little bit of a wake-up call in that regard, that I should probably think more about like what I am outside of work, or even like just disconnect from work, because like it can't be just all work at all times. And even though I enjoy it at least sometimes.
And
But
I guess by the way, Benedikt, like just to say, like I think that's the hard bit for many people, right? Is
yeah,
like that's we attach so much of our identity to the thing that we do, the thing that we work on, right? And it is significant, right? We spend, if you're kind of have a healthy kind of work schedule, you're spending 40 odd hours a week kind of working, right? So it's a significant part of our lives, but we kind of get it muddied by attaching our identities to it, and I've struggled with that, right? Like I've asked myself, like, if Adii is not the entrepreneur, right? If Adii sells his business and he does not start a new one, like what is Adii, right? And I don't have a great answer for that, except for saying that I will probably always be part entrepreneur, right? Regardless of what I actually do, it's just something that I identify with. But I think like that's the hard part there, and I think part of that reason is our work and ambition, it's just generally more predictable than what life is, right? And because especially if you have fewer humans in those kind of processes, right? Like it's just easier generally, right? It's not without its challenges, of course, but it's within our control. And I'm using air quotes there, right? For listeners that can't see me using air quotes. So it's within our control. So it's easier. Hence why work becomes an escape. I was there, especially in the first couple of years when Adii Jr. was born, like work was my escape. I wasn't productive necessarily, but it was my escape because it was easier, it was predictable.
Yeah. And the other thing that I've been noodling on since reading the book is user list isn't profitable yet. And that makes it super hard to, I mean, as much as I agree with everything we write in the book, it makes it super hard to just justify to just even think about it, because it feels like the moment I move my focus away from the business and from work, like my effectiveness on that part decreases a bit, or if the guilt increases or whatever. Like it feels like I have a problem there that I need to solve first before I can focus on anything else. Which, I mean, you're probably going to say that this isn't true, and there's a middle ground there, but it makes it, at least from an emotional standpoint, so much harder to not focus 100% on work all the time.
Yeah. Don't you think? I'll actually just throw a question out there. I won't even kind of have an opinion. Like, don't you think though that that perspective and that story is just one that we so often hear, that it's just become the most prevalent one, right? We've never really tested alternatives, right?
Yeah. Yeah, you might be right. Just it feels super hard with a decreasing bank balance on the business.
I think you're totally right, Adii, that is definitely the most prevalent story. It also feels pretty rational, for Benedikt in his position to say, well, I can either give more of my focus and attention to this thing, or I can give less of it to this thing. Rationally speaking, if you give something more of your focus and more of your time, it's going to you have a better chance of breaking through. You have a better chance of improving it, as opposed to letting something sit aside and decay. So maybe that's why it isn't tested. Maybe that's why the notion of overwork during a certain period of time is the conventional thought.
Yeah, and again, like I'm definitely not holier than thou in that sense. Like I've overworked myself, right, in the past. I like even in this week, right, the launch week, as we're recording here, is launch week for me, right? And I'm like I'm doing the book. I'm working on the first version for Cogsy, which is my new SaaS, right? And I'm closing a kind of a seed round of funding, right? And I do those things because at this stage, like everything is going mostly well. There's a lot of energy. I feel momentum. And I do it again, right? So I'm not holier than thou in that sense. And I agree, Brian. I think, and to Benedikt's point, like that perspective is the rational one, right? I And again, I somewhat stumbled into this notion that there might be an alternative accidentally. And kind of, I tell the story in the book, and the shortened version thereof is in 2016, just as I gotten kind of literally stumbled into mindfulness as the rest of my kind of life fell apart, I also set myself the very ambitious goal, because that's the only way to do things in the world of Adii, is to run a sub-4 marathon, which I kind of ended up doing, and I did it in Berlin. Very special kind of moment for me. It was my first marathon, ran almost 2,000 kilometers that year. And what literally happened that year was I was so like I was literally running for 9 hours. Like actual running time was about 9 hours, kind of a week, right? 8-9 hours. That excluded like recovery time. I was just in pain like all the time. I don't know, like anyone that's met me knows that I'm a big hunk of South African meat. I do not have a kind of little kind of slim down kind of literally kind of Ethiopian runner's body. I'm not that kind of African, right? And I was just in pain all the time. And what ended up happening is I had physically had no choice but to kind of just release a bit of that control or tight grip that I had on the business. I had to step away a little bit. And what ended up happening, and again, like I'm connecting dots here without saying that, because X is true, Y is also true. What also happened that year was that was our best year in kind of the whole of Convergio's kind of journey in terms of growth, in terms of kind of the good work we did. And again, like maybe that's just a sample size of one here, right? But I just think that there are other ways of doing this that like isn't just that kind of the prevalent rational kind of paradigm that we've become so used to, right? And again, like I think, like Benedikt, I mean, you've probably experienced part of this, right? Whereas 5 years ago, like you would have been kind of completely blasphemous for raising a bit of money, right? Yet kind of in 2020 and kind of beyond, we have these kind of bootstrapper funds now, right? Like there's this alternative way of doing things. It's not venture capital anymore. It's a different way. It's a different way to kind of how you would bootstrap or self-fund a business, kind of a software business 10 years ago. So like I'm just, again, like just making a case here for saying, firstly, I don't have all the answers about what those alternative ways might be, but I think that there are probably alternative ways. And again, like I think those alternative ways of approaching this probably lies very specifically close to our individual cores, right? Like I don't think like I can probably illuminate things for you. I'm not suggesting you should try and run a sub-4 kind of a marathon if that's not your jam, right?
That's not going to happen.
So, but there might be something else, right? That again, like works towards that notion of how do you create that space that perhaps it's about creating space, and you take that extra space and energy, and you still use the time and focus you have on user list. But it's a different energy, right? It's a renewed energy. It's a more productive or more effective or kind of more accurate energy almost. Anyway, that's like, those are some of the kind of at least ideas that I hope to inspire with the book. As I said, I mentioned earlier, like the last thing that I wanted to do was write a how-to book. I don't think that there is a specific recipe here for anyone. I really just wanted the book to be this kind of almost like, if you think lighthouse, that just shines kind of the light on things that people don't necessarily consider otherwise because they haven't heard those narratives.
I think that is where it's really successful as a book, is because the needle to thread there is, yes, things are extremely, it's really, really hard to build a business. It's extremely difficult and it requires a lot of time and focus. It's also true that when you're relaxed, when your mind is calm, or when your actual body is not tensed up, then you're actually more likely to get the results that you're striving for, that you're putting yourself through all of this suffering for. I'm a huge baseball fan, and so the image I imagine is it's the bottom of the ninth in the World Series, and this all-star hitter steps up to the plate, and they're just completely tensed up and squeezing the bat with all of that's not going to go well.
Yeah.
And that is the position as entrepreneurs we often put ourselves in, is a really important at bat, and we're just squeezing the thing with these white knuckles. And your book addresses the concept that to resolve that, it's actually a lot of mindfulness and philosophy and calm. So, one question I wanted to ask is, back to the idea that it's just completely sprinkled with all of these, wonderful quotes and philosophies on life. Are there a handful of books that you were reading while you were writing this one that were particularly influential?
Yeah. There's a whole bunch. What comes to mind? So I think all of Ryan Holiday's books, by the way, like for anyone that wants to get into the Stoics, some philosophy there, like read Ryan's books. Like I think that's a very modern, like easy kind of way to get into it. I also subsequently read kind of the likes of Seneca, Aurelius, like loads of those I also read. But Ryan's books like was very helpful there. Paulo Coelho's Alchemist. It's a kind of worldwide bestseller for the last 700 years or whatever. Like Paulo has been alive, right? And I only read that I think 2.5 years ago. Beautiful book. Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse. You very much kind of read that alongside The Alchemist. I think both of those are, because both of them are about journeys, right? So they were great. But then I also went totally kind of different path. I read Andre Agassi, the tennis player's book Open, right?
Yes.
Where he speaks about those kind of hardships and how he absolutely loves this thing and then he hates it and then he loves it again, right? So those are just a couple that kind of really, really springs to mind. And then within all those, there's just there's loads of poetry that I read. I especially like young Pablo, and he writes a book. The book is, he only has a single book. Very kind of popular contemporary poet, and he also writes kind of loads of these things about kind of coming back to yourself first, right? Because and he did I think I believe if I remember correctly, I use one of his poems in the book where it essentially says I can only, and I'm butchering this, I'm definitely not a poet of someone else's words, but this idea that I can only give to you what I already have within myself. If I don't have that thing, I can't give it to you, right? So again, that notion of the journey should be inwards first. That's the book's name. Young Pueblo Inwards. That's what the poetry is called. So anyway, those are a couple that come to mind. And I really try to be very diverse in that kind of reading. I almost read no business books for kind of about a year. And at that stage, I read less in the last year, but for about 2 years there, I read about 100 books in each year. And I said I really tried. I would probably say 20% of them would be classified as proper business books. Just because I think there's ideas here that we're missing. There's ideas out in the world that have been proven in a non-business context, and yet we haven't tried them within the business context because we're so kind of very narrow about how we measure that. Benedikt, by the way, the idea that sparked in kind of you telling that rational story of focus and user list and not being profitable, right? So firstly, I 100% get that, right? I've had to shut businesses down because I couldn't make them work financially. I think part of how I would define life profitability for you is that whilst it would really, really suck for you and Jane, if user list didn't work out, right? Yeah. I would think, for example, and if you had to shut this down, 3 months down the line, whatever the case is, this doesn't work out in this business, and you shut it down. I would still think that just the impact that you guys, as individuals have had, in the lives of those just people that I know, right? The communities that we kind of operate in, right? It's already been beneficial. It's not financially sustainable as a business, right? But it also empowered or enabled so many other things, right? And I said that again comes back to that tension of, if my business fails and I have to shut it down, that is a really, really tough point in anyone's life, right? But that should not be death in its own right? Because again, work is not life in that sense. And you guys have created so much other kind of life, or just life. You created so much life, so much positivity, right? That if you kind of netted that out, it is probably life profitable, right? So that's how I would kind of expand the context and expand the way we define measurements. And again, I don't say these things to be glib, right? I understand that for a business to exist, unless it's a charity and someone's going to pour money into this thing forever, it needs to be profitable eventually, right? I get that. I also just, as I said, I also just think that there's, even in that sense, there's a way to be life profitable if the business is not there.
That's a good thought. I really like that. I mean, you said this in the book. It's easy to just like go back to like the traditional metrics of like profits and revenue and stuff like that. But ultimately, I mean, that's not all of the stuff we create by building businesses. It's also all the people we help maybe run their businesses and stuff like that. And it's hard to attach like a measurement to it, but it's still, it still happened, and it's still a good thing, I guess.
Yeah, right. And if I can just imagine, guys, that years ago when we didn't have social media, right, and the news wasn't purely reporting on this business raising that and this business having revenue of that, and there wasn't a kind of a public stock exchange. None of these metrics mattered, right? We also only invented them because of capitalism, right? And again, like the universe doesn't exist just for capitalism to exist, right? Capitalism is merely a lens, or kind of a functioning system in which we kind of operate or self-organize as a kind of human race. But that is, again, like capitalism is not the human race, right? That is not the human condition. Like it's something that we created. So these metrics are also things that we chose. Hence why I think, like, again, I've said this often here in this conversation, I think a big part of life profitability is going back to yourself, right? Like, what do I actually need to live here? I do not need capitalism, right? Like I need kind of water and I need food, right? And I probably need family, right? And yes, money probably needs to buy me some of those things, right? But I don't need capitalism in its own right. So I also probably don't need the metrics attached to that. But somewhere we've decided, again, like this universal consensus almost, that certain metrics are important and we will keep measuring ourselves with that. And again, if you want to grow your business, by all means, track your MRR, right? But that's a very kind of narrow and specific metric for a specific cause. I like, in terms of kind of, how you chart your journey in your life, I just think that there's so many different things that you could be like, and again, when I say you, like each of us can be measuring, and they won't get reported on. Nobody, unfortunately, Benedikt, will write kind of a story about how many people's lives you touch, right? Or it's unlikely, because that people just, we also, again, like different tangent, but media doesn't report on those good news stories, right? Media reports on things that kind of gets them more news. So, but again, we could probably do that for ourselves, right? We could probably start setting a different context and, giving ourselves some space and measuring ourselves a little bit differently.
Well, it's been an incredibly fascinating conversation. Our guest today has been Adii Pienaar. The book is called Life Profitability, the New Measure of Entrepreneurial Success. Run out, grab yourself a copy. It'll do your heart some good. Adii, thanks so much for joining us today.
Gents, thanks for having me, and thanks for a fun conversation, by the way. Like, you asked me many things that put me on a whole different path, and some of these things, by the way, like I had to make mental notes, like if I ever write a second edition here or just a second book, like I totally need to kind of better explain that or just expand that. So thanks for the really fun and stimulating and life profitable conversation.
Our pleasure.
Indeed. Thanks for coming on.